You'll hear more from most of these people soon. Our keynote speaker, of course, is going to be Joe Van Eaton. Reginald Carter from the National Board, Brian Gertman, National Board, Paula Manley, National Board. And Brian, I think maybe you have a few people to introduce.
Yes. I'd like to welcome you to Missoula, as we've already been welcomed, but I would like to state that this is part of the National Federation of Local Cable Programmers Convention for the fall, and that we having all of you here. I'm going to announce our board of directors for the region, starting with Randy Ammon, which is the executive director for our secretary for the region is Patty Leahy. She can stand. She works at Community Television in Gresham, Oregon. Our treasurer for the region is Thomas Taylor III. He's the director of AgeWise in Portland. We also have other committee members, which include Organizational Development, Carol Burns, which is the programming Go ahead.
First time Community Television Olympia. I'm going to take this opportunity to ask you for two things. One is if you are an NFLCP member and you really believe being an NFLCP member is a good thing and you feel you could persuade other people to become NFLCP members, then I would like to ask you to be a member of the Membership Development Committee. The other thing is if you are aware of some little place out there in the wilderness where something is going on with cable television, no matter how small, where there are individuals that have managed to talk their cable operator into accepting an occasional program, that sort of thing, and there are people that are isolated out there that might like to be hearing from us, and you're aware of that kind of information about some remote little cable operation, we'd like to do some outreach to those folks.
Thank you. Next to her is Paul Simon. Paul is the executive director for Pocatello Cable Vision. He is informational services person dealing with the newsletter and all off the wire.
Yeah, we'll be editing and mailing out the Off the Wire newsletter. Trying to put a little committee together so anyone that enjoys writing or has any newsletter experience or ideas, I'd like to have you on the committee.
Public policy is headed by Alan Bruchon, who is from Salem, who's the executive director for NCTV.
I'll learn a lot of things. If you join our committee, you can write postcards. You can be on our phone tree. And then I want 5 more things. The first thing is a good Supreme Court justice. The second thing is a good Supreme Court justice. The third.
Conference planning is headed up by John Glasgow, the executive director of KLTV, Longview, Washington.
I'm actually thinking I'm kind of new to the job. I want to especially thank Randy. He did a fantastic job here putting this together, literally all by himself. Him and his board. These are the kind of people that really make conferences happen. I've got a board that, and they're not here, so I can say it doesn't work that hard. They're a good board, but they're not all that involved. I'm impressed with this board. What I would like to do in the coming months or years that we go on, I would like to set up some one-day conferences throughout our region at your centers. And so you will be hearing from your centers will be hearing from you. And please let me hear from you about any particular thing you'd like to have. I'm hoping I can get some flyers out. We'll tell you what experts we have that we can bring in on a one-day basis and maybe kind of do things up for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Person in charge of equal opportunity, Robert Swanson, which is the executive director of Toppenish Community Television, was not able to be here though, and so I have asked. Where's Jeff Schomer? Where's Jeff? There's Jeff. I've asked Jeff Schomer that if anybody is interested in getting onto the committee for equal him. We also have International Committee, a new committee developed by the National Board this year, and we happen to have that person on our board, except he was not able to be here either. From Ashland, Oregon, the executive director of, was it Ashland?
Ashland Cable Access.
Thank you. Ashland Cable Access, I thought it was Community Access. Pete Belcastro. And representing Ashland is Susie, let me make sure I get this right, Alftahidi.
Thank you. I'm not Pete Belcastro, but we are having the next Northwest Conference NFLCP in Ashland in May 1 and 2, and we would invite you all and all your friends to come to our beautiful city. Thank you.
Yep. So that completes our board. If any of you are interested in talking with them after the while dancing is going on, make yourselves available to them. Kim.
As always, there are some executive announcements that need to be made. You need to have your meal tickets out on the table, and I was told that if your meat is too rare, you should order chicken. I mean, they can send it back and they'll fix it. And as if Paula Manley were not enough fun all by herself, I hear that she has a special treat for us.
Thanks. Several faces look familiar from the Portland conference in July, and so some of you all saw the Voices of Democracy Living the First Amendment event that we had with the Portland National NFLCP conference. What we did was we took excerpts from that event and put it into an hour-long tape that will be distributed via Deep Dish TV October 1st and 3rd. So if anybody doesn't have their dish lined up to do that, you might want to attend to that. For those of you who don't have access to a dish, the tape will be available through the NFLCP main office. So what we have today is just a little short piece of that, which is a musical review of the 6 o'clock news with the anchormen, and you may recognize some of these folks. So let's roll the tape.
I'm your favorite anchorman. I'll be true to you. I'm the first bird, and I'll have the last word. Once my sponsor, tell me
perfect right to do. And my father told me I had to either obey the rules or leave the house, which, you know, is an easy thing for a parent to say when you know your kid has no income. So I held a grudge in those days for a long time. So I went to school the next day and I started to do a little research, and I came across the Third Amendment, which you haven't held any sessions on it. Which is basically, and I was from a military family, so it was pretty significant to me because it says no soldier can be quartered in your home without your consent. So I went home and told my dad to leave home. And that's when I learned the limits of constitutional argument. But anyway, Randy did say that one of the other things I should try to do was, he has this theory that the First Amendment was actually born here in Montana, or at least in Idaho. And he said, you know, he told me to use my best legal skills to come up with proof that it was born here in Montana, that Madison was, you know, trout fishing something or other. He thought this thing up. And I actually went and tried to research it. And you know, I looked in a lot of places. I found out a lot of things about Montana. I found out, you know, the second book in the state was published here in about 1867, and it didn't have any capital letters in it because the printers in the state didn't have any capital letters or any periods, so it only used commas. And I kept looking, and then, believe it or not, I actually found out that Montana can actually claim to be home of one of the great principles of First Amendment law, one of the great developments in First Amendment law. This is true. There was a Judge Borkwin here in Montana, and as you all probably will recall, right around the turn of the century, just as the First World War began, Congress passed a series of laws called the Espionage Acts, basically intended to prohibit anyone from interfering with the conduct of the World War. And people all over the country were prosecuted under this law for saying almost anything. Well, it happens that in a saloon here in Montana, somebody called Wilson a tool of the capitalist pigs. And, or actually that would be a more, it was the Wall Street tool, I think, was the then in vogue phrase. And he was arrested and taken to trial before Judge Borkwin. And Judge Borkwin announced what is the Montana saloon theory of the First Amendment. That is that people say a lot of things in Montana saloons and nobody pays any attention to it. That was only one part of it, though. The other part was that if the speaker wasn't shot on the spot, there really wasn't anything government could do about it. And this really was a revolutionary concept in the First Amendment. And when you think about it, I mean, it sounds very strange, but it really is revolutionary, because the idea is that the words the individual speaks have to be directly aimed at creating a danger that the state has a right to prevent, and where it's really probable that it will happen immediately. Not some curse against the president that nobody's going to act upon and nobody's going to hear, but something directly intended to incite violence, something that's likely to happen immediately. Then the state can step in, but otherwise the First Amendment protects speech. And it's startling. That decision was issued in 1918. We think of this as the 200th birthday of the First Amendment, but in fact, it's at least arguable that the First Amendment as we know it is almost entirely a development of the 1930s and the 1960s. A lot of the concepts we're familiar with just weren't thought of or weren't applied in law to protect anyone before that time. And what I'd like to do tonight is sort of go back a little bit about the history of the development of the First Amendment and how it progressed through time up to the 1930s. And then talk a little bit about what we can learn from some of the principles and some of the things that went on during that period, and maybe apply them to our own issues in access and some of the problems we're facing today. You know, there was a great debate, really, at the time the Constitution was adopted as to whether there should be a Bill of Rights incorporated then. And Madison actually suggested a Bill of Rights shouldn't be adopted. One of the this government, unlike the government in England, power went from the people to the federal government. In England, it went from the monarch to the people. What our Constitution gave was express powers to government, Madison said. And so it wasn't necessary to protect freedom of speech because no one had ever given the government the right to legislate in that area. And he said, if you put in the Bill of Rights, if you put in the Constitution something about speech, somebody in government is going to get the idea, well, it says no, but maybe I can do something about it. It does mention it here. Maybe he was thinking a little bit more clearly than one could have imagined it. But he found that the people wanted the guarantee. And so he and other Federalists moved to create, shortly after ratification of the Constitution, a Bill of Rights. And he proposed it originally in 1789, not in the form we know it today, in a way which really emphasizes, I think, the importance of individual expression, not just in some ways abstract expression. The way he actually framed it was that the people shall not be deprived or abridged of their right to speak, to write, or to publish their sentiments, and the freedom of the press, as one of the great bulwarks of liberty, shall be inviolable. And actually, in some ways, I like those words better than I like the way our First Amendment is written today, because it does so emphasize the role of the individual and of individual sentiment. But there was a great deal. It's clearly the First Amendment is an important, or the adoption of the First Amendment was important for many reasons, and you all know them from the history books. You know of the importance the framers put on the individual, of the importance of speech to the growth and development of government. That's all known. What's little known is how much free speech was honored in the breach. At the time of the adoption of the First Amendment, there was a concept going around called seditious libel. And the concept of seditious libel was you could say whatever you want, and you can't be stopped from saying it, but as soon as you say it, you can be arrested and punished. And in fact, the history of the United States contains a number of incidents of prosecution for seditious libel, not necessarily by the courts, but by the colonial legislatures. If someone criticized the legislature, you would haul them in before the relevant committee, ask them to recant, and if they didn't, you would throw them into jail for contempt. Or if they admitted they had spoken and criticized the government, you'd penalize them for causing unrest in the community. And in fact, under the doctrine of seditious libel, a true statement was more dangerous than a false statement, because a true statement was more likely to create real dissent. There were another couple of aspects about the First Amendment as it developed or as it existed at that time that sort of depart from our traditional notions of free speech. One is we view government as a protector of the freedom of the speaker. Government really didn't play much of a role protecting the individual speaker. Around the time of the Civil War, there was a abolitionist who moved his press to Alton, Illinois, and began publishing violent or very strong anti-slavery tracts. Well, that upset the townspeople, so they met in the office of the Attorney General of the state of Illinois, and they wrote out a letter that said something like, "We really respect the freedom of speech and your right to express it, but we'd like you to leave town. And if you don't, we're going to throw your presses into the river." And that was sent out of the Attorney General's office, to which the printer replied, "You'll have to do that over my dead body." So a mob formed, they threw his press in the river, and then they killed the publisher. There was no sense that that should be stopped. That was simply a response of the public to speech. Government wasn't seen as a protector of the controversial speaker. A third thing that you may know is that the Bill of Rights, or the First Amendment as written, only applies to the federal government. And in fact, at the time the Bill of Rights was originally adopted, Madison had proposed an amendment stated that no state shall abridge the freedom of speech. Well, that amendment was rejected by the House and the Senate. Never passed, never considered by the people. And Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1804, would say, I believe that the federal government cannot adopt sedition laws. But of course, that's no problem because the states can. They'll be able to protect us against seditious statements. So we had sort of a strange view of freedom of speech. In fact, tremendous principles. Everything you read in their history books, you know, all these wonderful statements of Locke and all the others, very inspirational statements. But in practice, there was much, much less protection for speech than we conceive today, and which we believe is essential today. So you may ask, how did that happen? It's actually a sort of strange tale about, as I mentioned, the Congress passed the Espionage Acts in 1918. And in 1919, a series of cases began going to the Supreme Court. The judges, like Judge Borklin, was one of the few that actually refused to convict under the Espionage Act. There was another judge in South Dakota who took much the same approach. And when the cases first came to the Supreme Court, it came before an extraordinary bench. Two of the members were Oliver Wendell Holmes and Judge Louis Brandeis. Now, the initial set of cases involved a number of socialists and communists who were distributing tracts opposing the war, in favor of unionism, asking workers to unite. And you'll recall this was a very turbulent time for labor relations in the country. And there was a real fear, because of the revolution in the Soviet Union, that the same thing could happen in the United States. The cases, a number of them involving Debs and most historical importance, a man named Schenck, came before the Supreme Court in March of 1919. And the Supreme Court was far behind Judge Borklin in Montana. In the Schenck case, which is probably the lead case of the series that came before the court at that time, Justice Holmes wrote the language you all hear about in school about you can't restrict speech unless there's a clear and present danger. And he used the analogy of a man shouting fire in a crowded theater. Everybody hears that. But what the opinion actually went on to do was convict the individuals for distributing the literature. And what Holmes said was, what Holmes affirmed was that if the state determined that their speech had a bad tendency to creating an ill that it had a right to prevent, then the state could punish them. It's far different than the sort of imminent harm. It's more like, well, if they say something that might be construed to somewhere lead to a problem and the state has a right to stop the problem, you can punish the speech. And that's the way the speech first went forward. Those cases first went forward in the Supreme Court. Those are among the first First Amendment cases to reach the Supreme Court in this country. The First Amendment was not considered a very important social value prior to that time. It didn't really make it to the court. Those issues just weren't considered. Then a sort of remarkable thing happened. A professor named Zechariah Chaffee decided to create a First Amendment myth. And shortly after the publication of the first Espionage Act cases, he began to write about the policies behind the First Amendment, ignoring what had actually happened historically in a number of cases, ignoring what Holmes had actually done in the espionage cases, and going back to the first principles, the rights of the individual, the importance of speech to government. And he talked about those in an article about free speech during a world war. And then he took Holmes's language and said, this language about clear and present danger really means that you can't punish speech unless it's directly intended to incite unlawful action. And in fact, there's a dangerous probability it will do that. Completely reversing what Holmes intended. But the strange thing is, Holmes read the article. He started getting letters from friends. He began debating it. And 4 months later, he began writing. He accepted the article's definition of his own opinion. He began to... This is what this became, and he and Brandeis proceeded to write a series of stunning dissents protesting other convictions under the Espionage Acts and adopting the very principles and myths that Chaffee had created in his articles between 1980 and 1919. And Holmes was actually something. I don't even know how to describe him. He must have been an awful person to work with. I mean, I'm not sure whether he ever believed any of the wonderful things he said about the First Amendment. But one who did pick up on them, and actually may be more important to our First Amendment development, was Justice Brandeis. And he actually came out of a consumer background. He had moved to the court, he had opposed monopolies, worked on antitrust cases. He had written a book called The Curse of Bigness, where his basic theme was that the importance of free enterprise is that it develops a self-reliant individual who's independent, confident, participates, and has the confidence to move forward in society. That's the value of free enterprise. And the danger of bigness is that it turns the individual into something small. That centralization ends up removing so many of the values that are central, both to the individual as an individual and to the nation in pursuing democracy. And that's, he took those principles that he had learned in antitrust law, he had applied in battling the huge corporations of the time, and applied them to free speech. And in the late 1920s, he wrote an opinion in Whitney, and I'd like to just read you a couple quotes from it. He saw free speech, the purpose of free speech. The purpose of free speech, he said, was to free men from the bondage of irrational fears. Fear of serious injury cannot alone justify suppression of free speech and assembly, he wrote. Men feared witches and burned women. If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. He believed that free speech promoted personal happiness. And he believed that that personal happiness, that personal freedom, was indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. And he went on to suggest that the exercise of free speech is a duty as well as a right, because it is so essential to the well-being of the nation. And that was the essential. So by the 1920s, the very foundation for what became Supreme Court doctrine in the 30s, was applied by the Warren Court in the 60s, was laid by Justice Brandeis in these dissents. And let's consider how those relate to where we are today, and what we are doing today in the access community. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what, in a very simple way, what are some of our problems in the access community. Well, the basic problem, as I see it, is that we've got a tremendous resource, and yet it's horribly underutilized, and its potential is not even close to being realized. I know many of you run wonderful access centers, but we all know there's about 1,000 access centers in the country and about 10,000 communities in the country. Thousands of people have no access to access, and thousands of people do not even know what access is, except perhaps what they see on Saturday Night Live. They have some sort of idea that it's out there. And we can begin to think about why that is, and one of the reasons I think that's obvious is that access users as a whole have never been able to truly develop legislative power. And one of the things I hear when I come to conferences, people are always asking me, can I sue somebody? And I'm always happy to answer that question. Of course you can sue somebody. But one of the things that was fundamental to the founders and all through in their principle was that the greatest protection for speech comes not through the courts, but from the individual and from the legislature. And ultimately, you have to count on the legislature to protect those rights. You have to be willing to enter the political battlefield and win there. And along those lines, Randy, can you cue this up? This is, if you could cue this up, this is Senator Burns on access at the NATOA conference.
So there's questions for the senator. Currently, many of us in our franchises have what are known as PEG, Public Educational Government Access Channels, and one of the benefits that our communities receive is that it really is a way for people to connect within the community, and particularly, you know, keep up on community events and those who might be, you know, more restricted, senior citizens, etc. And I'm wondering what provisions there are in your bill that protect the provision of these channels as a community resource, and also if Mr. Anstrom has any comments about his opinions on how the telephone companies might handle this.
Local access channels, provisions are there to provide that. And as far as the telco industry is concerned, I think the cable industry has done a wonderful job of providing these channels, and they've done it as a public service. Nobody had to go out and beat them over the head with it. But the public access is still the same rules will apply. I'm sure of that as far as public access, this type of thing. And I think given the cable industry, the way it grows and the way it goes, I think it'll. I think that those areas will be taken care of too as new technologies come on board. That can be done. You got to get somebody to pay the brakes, you know.
Could you be a little more specific? Protection of those channels and how the technology, how you anticipate that technology would deliver those channels?
Well, it's just exactly like the way the cables do it now. They're, in other words, we have the must-carry clause, and I tell you what, we have the different. I'll get this little thing started as far as must-carry and this type of thing. My bill is you have the option as a broadcaster or as a public access. You can either go down there and try to get paid for your signal, and if you choose not to, then they got to carry it. If you choose not to take any money at all for retransmission, and I think that's kind of what I'm not really sure what the broadcasters kind of want. Maybe they want a little money for it. Maybe the networks are making a big stink about this. I haven't. I know I didn't like the idea that CBS comes with must carry, must pay. I didn't like that at all. But public access, pardon? I can't understand a word you're saying. Really?
Is it,
Right.
are you talking about audio? Way matter.
Well, I don't know how we deal with it, but on the public access now, in my access and my education people in Montana will have a must-carry provision. I think if I can.
Okay, you can carry it on now. Senator Anstrom will proceed to try and explain what public access is.
Does this speak to legislative intent?
I'll tell you, this guy needs to be educated, folks. Not just, and I'll tell you, he's obviously been here. He's seen the studios, but he doesn't have any idea what public access is about, and more important, he doesn't have any idea what public access needs, and obviously, nobody on his staff is telling him. That means it's going to be up to us, taking our cue from the Founding Fathers, to be legislatively important and involved. You know, a second sort of problem I think we have, and there are obviously lots of things that affect public access, but I think one of the most important is that we're creating a nation of illiterates. And the more illiterate we become, the less important public access becomes. The less we need to speak to each other, the less we need these channels. And I'm going to tell you, this is at the National Convention, there were a number of speakers who talked eloquently about the effect of speech, of commercial speech, on the integrity of speech in this country. And many of you heard them there. And I just want to tell you, I heard people come out of that session and say, that's just some sort of lefty theory of the media. Well, you know, it really is. And I collect a lot of newspaper clippings and a lot of strange things. And I'm going to tell you, it's clear, if you listen to what the broadcasters are saying, what the regulators are saying, what some very important interests in our society are saying, it's obvious that the purpose of the mass media is increasingly merchandising, and that the purpose of merchandising is not advanced unless speech is diminished. And let me tell you some of the things. One of the most interesting one was something. I know I shouldn't criticize the National Rifle Association in Montana, but this has nothing to do with guns. It has to do with the free speech. The NRA's filed a petition at the FCC asking the FCC to reimpose the fairness doctrine for public broadcasting stations, not commercial stations. Why? Because public broadcasting stations are producing controversial programming. Why doesn't the NRA worry about commercial stations? Because commercial stations, you can count on the commercial advertisers to stop them from putting on anything that is ultimately against those advertisers' interests. That'll create a controversy, lead to a boycott. You don't need a fairness doctrine because you don't have to worry about them being controversial. You know, HBO, I don't know how many of you all saw an ad HBO ran the other day. I can't even remember what article, either Cablevision or Multi-Channel News. HBO runs an ad saying, when was the last time, do you believe that you're going to see a controversial documentary on a program sponsored by a floral company? And I thought, that's a strange thing for HBO to say. They want you to believe HBO is hard-hitting documentaries. So they're telling you that advertising is preventing controversial speech from getting on the most popular media today. That's kind of a strange thing. I look at the FCC's policy decisions, and I see that the #1 policy imperative for the FCC, and actually a policy imperative that's driving many things in the Hill, and if you listen more to Senator Burns' speech, you'll see this is partially what's driving him, is the notion that we have to have a policy that makes our communications companies competitive in world markets for selling hardware, HDTV, all those sorts of things, and software, not Flanding, Dallas, that sort of thing. And that part of our policy is to create these large conglomerations of companies precisely so they can merchandise better without regard to their obligations to the public interest. And the most interesting thing I saw, I actually found today. I was on a plane. I came here by an odd way. I came from Memphis to Minneapolis to Missoula, and I got to stay overnight in Minneapolis, and I picked up the Star Tribune. And they had an article about Business Week, a cover story in Business Week last week, by a former ad manager, writing about the purpose, how ad people viewed the mass media. And this is what he said. Advertisers have no functional concern with the meaning or consequences of mass communication except insofar as it provides a mechanism for the delivery of their messages to prospective customers. That doesn't mean, he goes on to say, that advertisers don't have control over content, or don't effectively, not direct control, but don't have an effect on the content of our programming. The media are so laced with advertising, he wrote, that some of it is so meretricious in its style of argument that it desensitizes us to the absence of integrity in human discourse. Media content has been driven primarily by the need to maximize audiences for sale, rather than by the desire to communicate the truth about our world or express deep thoughts and feelings. That's an ad exec writing. So these are tremendous forces in our society. And I think one thing we can learn from the history of the First Amendment and its development is how powerful the First Amendment myth is as a counterforce to these sorts of forces. An extraordinarily potent one, so potent that it led one of the leading jurists of our time to change his point of view in the course of 4 or 5 months. And so, I think part of our job in the access community is to reinvigorate those principles, to make them part of our mission in a very fundamental way, in every piece of literature we distribute, in the way we talk about this organization. That's critical. In the projects we undertake. There's absolutely no reason why we can't undertake projects that reinvigorate the community. And let me tell you, there is an extraordinary audience out there waiting for someone to come in and talk about reinvigorating the community. I was on a bus, I was telling people today, I was in Arkansas too. I went to Memphis, on to Arkansas, and I was on a bus with somebody from Arkansas who was telling me that the real concern she felt, she was worried because she was no longer able to pick up television stations that addressed her local concerns because of syndicated exclusivity and a number of other national policies. And she was telling me that the thing she missed most, or the thing she felt most that she was worrying, she was losing her community. Not just her local community, but her state community. And let me tell you, folks in Arkansas believe in that state. And I suspect folks around here believe in this state. And that loss of community on a local and on a state level is very deeply felt. And we ought to be thinking about projects we can do that will show that access is the reinvigorating force. It is part of the solution. We had talked at the National Convention about every access organization. You know, we spend a lot of time sometimes trying to get congressmen to write letters, write video letters to their constituency. Maybe what we should be doing is going out to the constituency and writing video letters to the congressman. We talk about the absence of debate. You know, we've got schools. 17 and 18-year-olds are the best debaters in the world. At least that's what I believe. And we could go into every school and make a part of curriculum citizenship projects that produce video debates shown in the community where the kids were asked to think about and debate important issues of the day. And really, like, you know, all this stuff that George Bush wants to put through as an education president, the cable industry wants to put through in cable in the classroom, really doesn't do the one fundamental thing that makes education meaningful, and that's make the students think and make the students speak. You know, that really was a revolutionary idea that Madison spoke about when he drafted the Bill of Rights. The idea that power flowed from the people to the government. And I think we need to begin to think about how we can make speech flow from the people to other people to the government. And I think if we do that, we can make access a significant and successful force in our community. Thank you. I demand a couple things when I come to speak. And Randy, could you come sign something for me? Could you? I wanted to get your autograph, but.
Careful of the chat.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, I couldn't decide mine.
This First Amendment should come here. This is the Weasel World News, which you can read, I think, if you promise to go to prison. Is that what it is?
Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to thank Hellgate High School and Proline for giving us some of the equipment that we've been using today. A lot of it's MCAT stuff too.
And Missoula Public Library.
And Missoula Public Library.